Hello and welcome to this video, guys. Today we're going to look into Control Value Accessor CVA, which is a design pattern used in Angular to create custom form controls. It is a way to extend the functionality of existing form controls, allowing developers to create new controls that can meet their specific needs. In Angular, a form control is a component that manages the state of an input element such as a text box or a checkbox. A CVA provides a way to create a custom form control that can be used in the same way as the built-in form controls. To implement the CVAs in your design, you can start by creating a new component that extends the base class Control Value Accessor. So that's what we're going to start off with. The first thing we want to do is to generate a new component. So let's go ahead and generate a new component. Let's call that component input component. So Angular generate component input. Alright, so obviously I tried to create it in the source folder. It should be created in the app folder, so let's go ahead and correct that real quick. So now that the created component is here, we can jump into the component. So there's one thing we want to do. We want to do implement Control Value Accessor. Alright, and we can also implement the interface of it because we're going to need to set a couple of different things. So once we have this, there's a couple of things more we want to do. Here we want to have a provider. So here we're going to make sure that we override the provider that we have for Control Value Accessor. So ng-value accessor, and here we can just forward ref. So we're going to forward whatever comes from the is a part of this ng-value accessor to the input component that we have. So if we would now, for instance, add it on a template called up input form control, it will be forwarded to the next to this component here. So this is exactly what the forward ref is doing in this case. A couple of more things we want to do. We want to add a couple of things. So we want to add the control here. We're going to say the control is going to be either form control or undefined. We can just give it this type for now. And then we are going to say is required. We want to standardize the way we set the required so that we don't have to pass it into the input component every time we want to set that. We will also want to have the is disabled here, set it to false. We have a subscription here, so destroy, it's going to be subject void in this case. Let's see, let's continue this story. No, destroy. Alright, so we also want to have the private touch, which is going to be of just a callback function like this that will take the type T. Also, we can say we're going to take the type T because we do not know if the form control is going to be of type string, number, and so on. So we can use the generic type T in this case. All right. So the first thing we want to do is use we want to inject the injector. Sounds pretty fun, right? So this will make it possible for us to essentially receive the value. We'll get to that shortly. So once this is injected, we can go ahead and create, can add the ng-on-init. Also, we need to on init. We can import it. So now that we have the ng-on-init here, we can say we want to fetch the form control, and we also want to see if the form control has a validator. So yeah, control has validator. If it has the required validator, then we know for a fact that it is going to be, let's see here, required. So we don't really need to pass in an input here defining whether it's required or not. We can just listen to the validators that's connected to the input field to determine whether it is required or not. So we'll do it in this way so that we manually don't have to do any work. All right, so the first thing we really want to do, now we're only listening for the form control. So there's a couple of more things we want to do. So we can go ahead and add the try. And here we're going to say const form control is going to just be what we have up here. We can just pass this in. Let's see, in this way. And we can change form control to ng control in this case. All right. This is the default anyway. So also we can say switch. We're going to check whether the form control constructor, if this is a form control name that's being defined, then we want to be then we want to be able to say that, all right, this dot control equals to this injector and we're going to fetch it from the form group directive, because you can only use the form control name alongside with the form group, otherwise this won't really work. And let's import the form control name as well, and we also want to fetch our current control. All right, so the form control here, it's the one we have up here, so as form control name. All right, so once this is done, this is just for using the form control names, but we're not done here really. We want to have, let's add the catcher so that the error is gone. So we want to be able to continue. We want to say, all right, so as the default case will be, we don't need to have any other case, so it's that we're passing it in as a form control. So form control as form control directive. So if it's of the form control type, we can essentially just fetch it as in this manner. So we can access the form and we can say that the form control we have, the item, the element, or the actual form control can be received or fetched in this way. All right, so now on the error, in case we would receive an error, let's just make sure that the code won't crash. So here we can say form control will define a new form control here with the undefined value. So in this case, we are essentially setting the component control. So we can just create a function here called set form control, and this is the logic we can have. So we'll just on init here would call set form control to set the value. All right, since the control is essentially going to be this value or undefined, we need to just make sure that we can also go ahead and say false. All right, so if it's not set, we're going to set it to false. All right, so this is the way we can set the form control. Now we'll be able to access control from here. We can utilize it in the HTML and so on. And the last thing we want to do is essentially we need to tweak these functions that we have, right? They're not implemented yet. So we start from bottom. So we'll say this, and we're going to set it to our disabled value. So it's disabled true. And here registerOnTouched, it is our callback function from here. We're only going to set it to be the function, and we can give the function the same type as it has up here. So it will be an empty result that will return a value in this case. All right, so to continue, we have the most interesting one, which is the registerOnChange. This is the method we'll come to shortly. So we'll get to the registerOnChange shortly. We'll start with the writeValue here. In this case, we're going to say, all right, this dot control. If the control is set, we're going to just set the value. If it's not set, then we have an issue, and then we need to do something. Maybe we need to generate a new control value. So we can do it in this way with a ternary, and we'll just generate a, sorry, it should be object here. Maybe we should just change the object to value, because we're going to write the value and it's going to be of the type in generic type T. All right, so in this way, if we have a control, we'll set the value. If we don't have a control, we will create a new control and set that value to the control. All right, so we have some sort of a recovery from the error if we would have some issues. All right, so getting to the registerOnChange here, there's a couple of things. It all depends on the requirements, I would say, from UX really. So it all depends on if you want to have inline validations and so on. So there are a couple of ways to do this really. I usually have a subscription here, and I do value changes, and I use the pipe, and I start using I start here by using the let's see, we will import the take until here. We make sure that we're destroying it on component unmount. So we also want to go ahead and use start with. So we want to make sure that we're not repatching values that already exist, because that will trigger a change that we might not want to have. All right, so we can use the distinct until changed in this way. Let's go ahead and import that from ArcGIS. and here we can say tap. So we're going to do something with the value, and then we're going to call the actual value in this way. All right, so we can import that, the tap function, so it will just forward it and set it to the function from here. And we will only do this in cases where the function in this case would be, let's say, for instance, if you have a change, an actual change in value. So if the value would be same as previous, it would not go over these two subscriptions. So now we need to use the subscribe here. And here we can determine the logics that we want to have, right? So I usually set it up to be mark as touched. Mark as untouched. The logic I usually set up with my form controls to get a certain user experience is that, for instance, if you have an input field, say we have an input field, I'm starting to type something, I blur from the field, I receive the error that something is wrong with the field, I go back, when I start typing again, I want to get rid of the error message. So putting this control mark as untouched will make it possible for us to really get rid of the error messages as the user is typing. You can determine whether you want to have it or not. In my cases, I will show you the logic in a real use case and how it can work. So we're going to keep it with this. All right, so now we are pretty much complete. The only thing I would say is that you would have to implement this logic for all of your own self-programmed components, so input components, select components, and so on, and that does not really make sense for us. So what we are going to do to generalize it even in a further level is to create a directive which will implement this base logic so that all of our form controls would behave in the same way. All right, so we can create an directive here. So Angular generate directive, and we're going to call it Control Value Accessor. All right, so we know for a fact that this is going to be used for all of our form components that we have. And here we can just substitute a bit of the logic, right? So we can remove all of this, really put it here like this, and we can just go back to the input component once again, and we can just make sure that we implement the Control Value Accessor directive. So now we're moving this kind of logic to the Control Value Accessor. So we can essentially just remove everything from within the input component because we want this to be standardized amongst all of the form controls that we have. So instead of creating one for each one of the form controls, we can do it in this way and just keep one for all of it. Obviously, we need to import all of the missing imports that we have, and we also need to give it the generic type T. And then we are pretty much set to reuse this directive in all places. So this is expecting the generic type T to be passed in from the input component. And now we have some errors here, which is extends, blah, blah, you need to inherit this subclass. Yeah, obviously we need to remove the implements to extends in order for us to actually use this logic. And we can remove stuff from here. So keep in mind, this will be good in terms of testing. We will not have to test all of the components logic when it comes to the behavior of the forms. This can be tested for the control value accessors that we have, which is quite awesome. So look at the amount of code we have in our input component. It will be minimalistic. So there's a couple of things we want to have in our form control. We want to have the wrapper. So let's call it, we'll call it dev by seb. So DVS form control. It's always good to wrap it with your own prefix. And we'll have a label, we'll have an input, and we can have, if we wanted to have, the errors are going to be removed from here now. And we can say the input is going to receive the form control that we are generating from the directive. So keep in mind, by extending it, we'll be able to access all of the values that comes from here. So we have the control here. In this case, we're going to set the control here. And since we haven't imported the reactive forms module yet, let's navigate to the app module and do that for now. Reactive forms module can be imported from Angular forms. All right, so now that is done, this should now work. And as you can see here, the control might be undefined in some reasons, so we can just put an ng if here to make sure that if the control is not defined, we can always wrap it in this way. So now we always need to make sure that we have a control. If it's not defined, it will be defined through the directive here. With some cases here, if it would crash, it will define it. If you don't have anything when we try to write a value, it will create a new form instance. So this will essentially it will be handling itself, you could say. So now we have the input. So here instead we're going to go with input ID. So this is good for us in order for us to bind how the form and the labels will be connected. We're also going to make the label optional. So we can also say we're going to print it. We'll do ng if the label is set. We're going to have the label, and here we probably want to have some type. So input type, or we could just go with type in this case. All right, so now we have three props. So input, label, and input ID. Sorry, input ID, label, and type that we want to have. So we could just go ahead and add that real quick to the TS file as inputs. And you could argue whether you should have some of them as generic ones from the control value. Maybe you want to have the label and the input ID really to be something that comes from there, but let's not do it for now. This is something you need to argue with in your when you do this with your team. All right, so we have the type. Type is going to be of a couple of different stuff. So we can say type input type. So we can say the input type is going to be either text, it could be number, email, password. I just remove a couple of them. As you can see, we have some stuff coming from the Google Copilot, which is quite awesome. So we have text, number, email, password. I think this is pretty much enough for us. So we'll go ahead and give it a type. And sorry, I have fat fingers, sorry. All right, so input type, here we can give it a type text. So doing this, we are essentially saying we have a default type text, but it can be of any of these types. So now TypeScript and the CLI will be able to actually determine if we have some syntax errors and so on build state phase. If you would give it another prop, if you want to have other stuff, you would just add it here. All right, so now that we have the input component with the label and the type, we can just make sure that we don't have any errors in the HTML. All right, so this means we're pretty much good to go to start with this reusable form element. So let's put the browser next to the screen. So now that we have it up and running on the next screen, let's go ahead and go to the app component where we're going to create a form control. So first and foremost, we're going to try it out. Test control is equal to new form control. Like this, we're going to give it a default empty string value, and we're going to pass this into the, if we go to the HTML of the form app component, we should be able to do it. Because we're importing everything in the app module, you should not do this. You should most likely have a input module that would be imported here. We're doing this just for being able to test it real quick and show you how it could look like. So we're passing in the test control. We need to give it a label, hello. We can also give it the input ID, my ID. So all right, so we can see how we have some errors here in the console. It just says that we need to have multi-true. We're going to make sure that we add the multi-true for the ng-value accessor. So going to the input component here, we can just give it the multi-true here, and it should work eventually. So now we can see that it's actually working. Now we can give it some styling so that it looks a bit better. DVS form control. We can also say the label, input, display block. The label, we want to have some sort of a margin bottom. Maybe you want to have 4px. We want to have it font weight a bit bolder. Let's try 600. I don't have any fonts installed right now, so it might look a bit strange. So we'll go ahead and say input. We want to have a padding of 8px. Let's go to the app component CSS file to add some margins. So that we have some jumped in content so that it's easier to preview. Alright, we also want to say the input field with 100%, and we want to set border because now it's, you see, it wraps the margin that we have. We need to set, it needs to box sizing, border box. This will tell the CSS that to take the padding within consideration so that it won't jump and you won't have to have negative margins and so on for the width. Alright, so now that we have our input component, I think it looks quite good for this small amount of time we have spent with it. Let's try to give it a default value here to see what would happen in the app component. So let's go to the app component file, my default value. It should be entered here. So when we change it, we should also be able to, let's say, validators.required. So let's import this and save. So I'm shrinking the rows here so that it's easier for us to see all of the code at the same time. Going to the let's go to the input component. Really, we can go here, we can say we're going to print all of the errors we have. So we can say control the errors, and we can print it as JSON to see how it would look like. We don't have any errors now, but removing it would have the required true. So this means that the error management or the error things is working. This is a custom validator coming from, or coming with, really, the reactive forms. So the forms, it's built in, essentially. You don't have to build it. And also we want to say, if it's required, we want to add the asterisk here maybe. I've seen many UX designs talking about that. It might not be a good case to do it, but let's go ahead and do it anyway. So if it's required, we want to add the class required, and then we can go to the CS file here and say, if it's required, we want to add the after. Yeah, let's give it a hard-coded value here with the content star, and as you can see, it's appearing here. So now imagine we also want to, on the input field, obviously, we want to have set required is required here so that we have some sort of a good way of showing it. Obviously, it's not going to be showing null here when we don't have any errors. We're just printing it here to see whether there's a good way for us to actually create a simplified way of logging the errors, so that we, on each and single one of the cases we utilize this component, have to specify ng if this error, ng that, if, and so on, because that will be super annoying. All right, so now let's continue and try how it would look like with form group, sorry. So we create a new form group. We have tested the form control, it works quite nice already, so we can test out the form group. Here we can say name, and we're going to give it a new form control in this way, and this is the default value. We don't need any default value, so we just want to try out how this would look like in case we have a form. So we would have a form. We're going to specify the form group that we added. So I don't really remember what we put the name to. Let's see if we have some IntelliSense. No, we did not. So the app component, yeah, we just gave it the name for group. We'll wrap it in this way. And instead of having the form control here, we want to be able to write the form control name. And here we want to give it the name, obviously. So this is the name of the form control. So the name that we, sorry, I keep adding this one. So this is the name of the form group element. So this should also work. So we can either use the form control name or form control. If you go to the Control Value Accessor directive here, you can see here is for the form control. It will behave in a way that it will fetch the form group, and then it will fetch the actual control of the form group. Just like the way we're doing it. So we can see that both cases essentially works for us, which is quite awesome. This is exactly what we wanted it to work in, but let's remove it and just keep the form for now. And we have the required here. We could add some error outputs. So the way what we want to avoid is having to write, let's say, all right, we have an error here. I've seen this many times. I think this is super annoying, but you could have form group dot controls dot name dot errors, and here you could select the required. Let's see here, required. Let's see what it complains about. Oh my god, it needs to be accessed in this way. So let's see what it complains about now. It's possible null. Okay, so this field is required, right? I think this is a very cumbersome process to have to add at all places. So if you would have 10 different errors for this field, you would have to insert them in this way. I think this is not something you want to do if you're going to work with enterprise applications. This is going to clutter down and take a couple of time, like it will build up the components that you have. So an alternative way to do this is you can eventually just standardize it by creating a component that will just, since you can see here, it's key value based in this case. In some cases there might be a key, and then an object as the value, which maybe has the max length and so on of a string. It could be different pattern that needs to be used. But anyhow, you could standardize this logic in your component. So you could create a new component that will receive this error and translate it in a certain way. We are not going to do this in this video. What we're going to do here is essentially just loop through it. So just to see how it would look like for the input component. This should most likely, as I mentioned, you know what, let's create that component. It goes super fast. So we'll generate a new component. So ng generate validation errors. So we'll generate the component with the validation errors logic. So app validation errors. Here we're going to pass in the control.errors, okay? So just as errors, obviously, like this, so that we can handle this in the validation errors components, because we most likely want to have the validation errors for all input fields that we have. So going here, we can say, all right, so we're going to take the input errors, which is going to be, I think it's record, string, and validation error. I'm not entirely sure about the typing really, but let's do it like this. You could investigate a bit to see what would happen. So here it gives us, it could be validation errors. So awesome that we have some IntelliSense, but also says that null, so it could also be null in this case. All right, so now we have given it a type here, which is record is saying that it's, instead of having the cumbersome name that it had before when you had the an object and you would have a key, which is a string, and then that could be blah blah blah. Record is just a way of doing this typing so that you won't have to do it in your code. So it's quite awesome. All right, so to continue with this, we were receiving the errors here, as you can see, we're having the error output here. So let's go ahead and just print it just like we did before. So it's just going to be errors, right? And here we could say, we're going to create a list, which is going to list all of the errors that we have. So ng4 let error of errors, and then we're going to say key value. And the reason to why we want to have key value is because we want to be able to, we can say key error value. So in many cases the value will always just be true, and in this case the key will make more sense. So in the TS file here, imagine now we would have translations or something. We could have, for instance, let's call it error messages in this way, and here we can say the required blah blah blah. So it's just a key value based error message that we want to have. We could also have an input here so that we could override it, but let's not do that for now either. So error messages, now we could say, all right, we have the object and we want to be able to really fetch the data from that object in this way. So now it complains a bit that the string required has no index signature. So what we need to do is essentially go to the validation errors component TS file and say, all right, this is going to be of record string. So it's a key value based value, and the error will be gone. And as you can see here, this field is required. Prompting something will remove it, removing the stuff will also. So, and as you can see, when you come into a page or to a form, you don't want the first thing to be that you see an error message. But let's go ahead and give it the validation errors. We can just give it some styling so that it looks better. We'll go ahead and say margin 0, padding 0. We want the LIs to have a color which is going to be red. We can also remove the we can remove the padding here, and we can say maybe padding left 10 px just to make it aligned. That was too little. So now we have it aligned in this way. We can also say margin top is going to be 4 px in this way. And we can also say the font size is going to be decreased a bit. Let's say we're going to say 0.8 rem. So now we have the error messages printed in this way. If you have more than one, they will be listed under each other, right? So this is how you could standardize the way the errors are handled in here. We could also add an input here saying custom error messages, which is also going to be a record. So if you want, for some strange reason, you want to extend it or add a custom message, you could do this. So this is one way of doing it, and then you could implements ng-OnChanges. So implementing the on changes here, you could just add it, usually put the lifecycle looks afterwards, so you can say const. Here we want to destruct the custom error messages, messages, and here we want to say from the changes. Let's go ahead and copy it. So if this has been changed, what we want to do is we want to combine the error messages, and you want to put what you had before at first, and then you want to spread in the new values so that the new values would override the previous ones. So this is one way of you actually being able to pass this in, and obviously you need to add this within the input component as well. So let's go to the input component TS file real quick. We can just add it here. It's just going to be a forwarder really. We're going to forward it to the validation errors that we have. So in this way we can save it. Saving it in this way, now we can pass in whatever we want from the app component. So let's say we have custom error messages. So error messages, we can say if it's required, the name field is required, instead of having it to be generalized. If you want to have it in this way for some reason, this is the way you should do it. So error messages, we go to the HTML here, we can pass it in here, we can say custom error messages is going to be received from our messages, and as you can see here, the name field is required. This is one way of standardizing something. You build a component which is kind of stupid. It handles the base cases, but you can always extend it and make it much better than it is. So this is one way of actually utilizing the control value accessor, and as you can see here, it's minimalistic code that we actually have in our input component. We could do the exact same thing, just copying the code and creating a new component. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to create a new generate, so ng generate component select. We're going to create a select component which is going to utilize the default HTML behavior. In this case, we're not going to create a custom logic for that. So going to the TS file, we want it to be able to work in a similar way that the input field worked. So let's go to the input field real quick. And we're going to just copy everything from providers. We want it to be here. So just paste it there. We can import everything. We can remove the input component here. We just need to substitute to use existing here so that it actually utilizes the select component. And the last thing we want to import is essentially some inputs that we have here. So we can paste it. We want to have not input ID, but rather select ID. Label can still be there, and type is not really required here anymore, but the other ones can still be here. All right, so here we also want to make sure that we actually extend it. We can use it with type T, generic type T. If you know the type already, you can just give it a type, but we do not know it at this point. It could be objects and so on, but let's continue. We have the select now. We should be able to add the select. Let's go ahead and go to the HTML here. We could say, all right, we're going to use the select, and here we have some options, right? And we can loop through the options. So we're going to take in options as an input as well. All right, so this is going to be default value and empty array, but it's going to be of type T because that's what we're essentially going to set to the front control. So the options of T, and let's go to the select component HTML file. We have some errors here, so it's going to be, just going to have a list in this case. You could have key value based. We're not going to have key value based right now. You could or should probably have it because that makes more sense, but in our case we're going to make it simple for us. So we're just going to go with option. So whatever we have as a value will also be whatever has an option. So if you go to the app component now, we could have, for instance, I'm not going to say gender because I think that's yeah, it's widely talked about, but let's go ahead and say age. And the default value of the age will be, say, 0. Now we want to go to the app component HTML file. We can just go ahead and just make a copy of this. This is going to be select, so we're changing it to the select, and here it should not be name, it should be age. Now we don't have any pre-filled value, we don't have any stylings either for that, so we could go to the, let's go to the input really, and just make sure that we copy whatever we had in the HTML. Going back to the select here, we could just replace the select with whatever we had in the input here, and this should also be select ID, and then we should place the ID here. This is going to be select ID. All right, so we don't have any styling for it, so you should probably have a globalized form that you can import that would style them so that they look similar. Not going to do that right now. We can just be a bit lazy, I would say, and do it in this way. So now we're going to be able to pass in stuff from the here. We're just going to create options, and this is going to be an array. Let's just give it a couple of values that we have, 1, 2, 3. So as you can see here, you're going to be able to select the values here. So we have the reactive forms also working in a way here. To make sure that it does work, we could say form group value, and then we're just going to print it as a JSON here so that we can see the value. So the name is an empty string, and the age is not changing at all. So we need to check why the age is not changing. All right. So let's jump into the HTML here. I'm pretty sure we forgot to add the form control here. So we just need to attach the form control here, just like we did in the input component. So now it should work as expected. As you can see, it's 0 and the name is an empty string here. So entering something here will be presented here. Changing the value here, you can see the age 1, 2, 3, and so on. So this, my friends, is how you can utilize the value accessor, control value accessor, creating a custom directive in order for you to reuse it amongst different form controls and create a custom library that behaves in the same way. Thank you for watching, guys. All of the best. Bye.